I am Macarena Navarrete, board member of Invest, managing partner of EY, and today I wanted to take a time out of script to thank David Gallagher. Probably you don't know, but if it were not for David, ChileDay would not be what it is today. Since its inception, David has been supporting the ChileDay, and he gave us his support when he was an ambassador and later. And if it were not for him, we would not have been able to reach the kind of presenters and people here in London we have been able to reach. And it is him who probably set the basis for the greatness of the ChileDay. So thank you, David, very, very much. After that, I want to thank the extraordinary panel we already have for their valuable contributions, and I will have the privilege of presenting our next panel. This panel is very interesting because we'll examine the geopolitical context that shapes the world globe nowadays and the regional strategies that need to be followed. We will be talking from great power competition to energy transition, and our experts will unpack that impact both in global markets and in Chile's positioning. So let's welcome Rachel Ellehuus, Director General of RUSI, John Griffiths, Chief Strategist of AthenaLab, María Luisa Puig, Latin America Director of Eurasia Group, and again, David Gallagher, former Chilean ambassador to the United Kingdom, who will moderate this conversation and for which I ask you an applause.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that very generous introduction. We have a great panel today. This is the second year in which we have a geopolitical panel. Obviously, because of the state of the world at the moment, geopolitics has become a big item of consideration for all of you, for companies, for corporates, for banks. So it's a great pleasure to have this very distinguished panel to talk about these things. Rachel, I wanted to start with you. So many issues. I don't know where we start, but Ukraine, China, Russia in general, is it on the rampage? I believe it's not very keen on Western think tanks these days. You may explain why. Anyway, it's one thing after another, a little bit more unpredictability in the United States of America with the new government. So give us your ideas of where we are and what we can do about it, if anything.
Excellent. Well, thanks to everybody for turning up and listening to geopolitics. It's quite a change of topic from the last panel, but hopefully it'll all come together in the end. So as introduced, I'm Rachel Ellehuus. I'm the Director General of RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, just around the corner. You can probably hear from the accent, though, that I come from a bit further away, North America. And previous to that, I lived in Brussels. So I hope throughout my remarks you will take from it that although an American, I've spent time living in Europe quite a bit, and through my work at RUSI have gained quite an international perspective. And I start that way because you said, well, really where to start? Do we start in Europe with Russia, Ukraine? Do we start in the Middle East with Israel, Gaza? Or do we go all the way to the Indo-Pacific and think about China's role in its immediate neighborhood? And I would say, well, let's not start in any of those places. Let's rise above and kind of think about what's going on here. What are the trends that connect these three scenarios and others, including in Latin America? And I think what we see going on at the highest level is first of all, a breakdown in the international order and the multilateral systems that have served us for so long. In the case of Europe, organizations like NATO and the EU have become very unwieldy, with 32 members in NATO, 27 in the EU, and they don't always see eye to eye. So it's really hard to say, all right, here are our priorities, and here's the general direction of travel that we want to go over the next 3 to 5 years. And so members of those organizations, as well as other regional organizations and the United Nations, are kind of backing away from a one-size-fits-all solution that they've found in the past through these multinational organizations, and they're looking closer to home, to maybe national solutions, regional solutions, sub-regional solutions. So just to take, another example here in the UK, a little bit closer to home, you saw the Strategic Defence Review from the UK come out and for the first time talk about a NATO-first approach. So that's a reflection of the UK looking around in the world and not saying, okay, well, we will have global interests, we will have global reach, but at some level, in our own neighborhood and at home, it's NATO and the North Atlantic and the European continent and the transatlantic space that is our first priority. So to me, that's a reflection of a lack of trust in those international organizations and multinational organizations to get things done. And I expect that's replicated in other regions of the world. Secondly, and this is really the elephant in the room, is the role of the United States. I think it's very easy to look at the current US administration and say this is something that's new, that's developed with Trump. But I would go back at least a decade and say that I saw the signs of the US wanting to back away from having a leadership role in the world all across the world. If we go back to President Obama, he talked about the US leading from behind. He talked about having others step forward into that place. He talked about the rebalance to Asia and prioritization in a US context. So it's, and repeated secretaries of defense have asked Europeans and others to step up and take on more responsibility for their own security. So that aspect of it isn't new. What I do think is new coming from the US over the last not even a year is just this total abdication of a sense that the US should be a benign hegemon in the world, that the US would lead and would lead even at the detriment of its own interests. No more is the US signaling that it's willing to subsume its national interests to a collective good or to global stability. So whether we're talking about Ukraine, Russia, or we're talking about the Middle East, or we're talking about what's going on closer to home in the US's southern periphery and Latin America, it's national interests first. And moreover, it is about largely working with other large powers that are perceived to be strong to pursue those national interests, and small and medium-sized countries we'll just have to sort of go along with the general direction of things. So for all of you, when you're thinking about geopolitical risk and how you manage the two macro trends that I've pointed out, I would say, as a start, and we can have a conversation, number one is diversify your relationships. Just as investors, you would diversify your portfolios to spread out the risk of any one of them going wrong, I would recommend a diversification of relationships. So if you are working with the US, don't rely solely on the federal government. Make relationships with states, governors. We just saw the Kingdom of Denmark go straight to the state of California to make a deal on offshore wind. They got some flack then from the federal level, but it was a way to signal that these relationships will go on, even the absence or the breakdown of more traditional relationships. So that's kind of my first piece of advice. And then the second would be, mainly in a European context, is just to note that the window of opportunity here is small. We're in a period where the US is still relatively engaged in Europe and NATO and working primarily with the UK. I think it's this week we have the state visit by President Trump. And Russia is still down. They're not entirely reconstituted. They're struggling in Ukraine, even if that's not always apparent. They're struggling internally. So this is a very limited window to act, to prioritize, to get things done. We had some good progress in a NATO context earlier this year with the NATO summit, where countries agreed to spend 5% on defense. Part of that for more traditional things, part of that for cyber, tech, and less traditional hardcore defense requirements. But I think it's a very narrow window where you can step forward while the US is engaged and start to reorient those dependencies. And that's true certainly here in the UK, where there is that uniquely close relationship across the Atlantic. But I can see Prime Minister Starmer and others spending more time in Europe or Asia through some of the AUKUS partnerships to diversify. So again, act fast and diversify, but I expect we can go into some of the details of how we might do this as the conversation proceeds.
Thank you very much, Rachel. There's really good advice about having a relationship with American states. I mean, we have in Chile, a very good MOU kind of relationship with California, and I think that's really good advice. To turn to María Luisa Puig, you work in Latin America, the Eurasia group. I mean, looking at Latin America today in the context of the world, I mean, it doesn't look as bad as it did, maybe, in a way. I mean, there seem to be one or two eyesores, like Venezuela, but on the whole, it's not working too badly. I mean, what is your view? What's going on?
Yeah, I guess that when we look at the region, I mean, of course, we are looking at a huge region with countries that have a lot of differences, but at the same time that share sort of some of the same challenges and opportunities as well. So I would take one of the points that Rachel was mentioning, and when we try to look at the outlook of the region, we think of three, or we can think of three broad topics. One is US policies. The second one is security, and the third one is the upcoming electoral cycle. Many of these countries are going to have elections soon, including Chile. In terms of US policies, Latin America is not necessarily a priority for President Trump, but of course his policies, and that means direct or indirect, are going to have an important effect on the region. And with that, I refer to any type of policies and the impact that has on growth, on inflation, on trade, immigration, which is an important topic, particularly for Mexico and Central American countries that depend significantly on remittances, the fight anti-narcotics, which we are seeing more of that recently, the efforts or the ongoing efforts to counter the influence of China. We can see that in the world, but for sure in Latin America. And I guess that one of the main questions is how are Latin American countries going to respond to those challenges, right? And we probably see one of the first distinctions has to do with the North and the South. So we have countries at the North like Mexico and Central America that depend strongly on the US, and probably we're going to see much more willingness or need to make concessions in order to maintain good ties, good terms with the US. When we try to see the response from South America, that gets a bit more complicated and difficult, given that many of these countries still have a very strong relationship with China. So that's probably going to be another example of countries trying to maintain good ties with both countries to avoid taking sides where possible, but that's certainly becoming more challenging in the current context. The second big issue is probably security. So, you know, like when you go to the specific countries, they tell you about the security situation, and I don't know how much perception there is that this is a problem that goes beyond the borders, right? That it's not unique to the specific country. We have seen a rise or a problem of violence in much of the region. That, of course, has an impact on investment, has an impact on rising operational costs, but it also has an important impact on politics, which is becoming much more obvious. So if you see the polls recently, and again, not only in Chile, but across the region, you can see that security is at the very top, of concerns for voters. And that is a change, because if we go to some years back in history, not long ago, it was corruption, it was the economy, and at the moment it is security, the main problem for voters. So this is this also takes me to the next topic, which is the election, because as security concerns increase, that is also one of the factors why it is probably why we are probably seeing conservative candidates having an edge in the polls in different upcoming elections. So we have had recent elections in the region in which we have seen continuity. So the election of Sheinbaum in Mexico, after the government of AMLO, he ended up still with very high levels of popular support. The re-election of Noboa in Ecuador, but what we expect in upcoming elections is to see more change than continuity. So probably incumbent parties still doing well or being very competitive in Costa Rica or Brazil, but probably some more change, as we saw some years ago when there was this rejection to the incumbents in the previous electoral cycle. But I'll stop here and yes, happy to go more in depth into these issues later.
Thank you very much, María Luisa. John, well, security, you're an expert on security, working on it in AthenaLab, the security think tank in Chile, which, by the way, is very close to RUSI. In Chile, I mean, I get the impression that there is a sort of wave of organized crime spreading around Latin America. We used to think of it as a Mexican problem, where the whole areas of the country were dominated by cartels. Then, you know, some of these cartels seem to be coming from Venezuela. It's obviously becoming a Latin American problem. It's probably an international problem. But could you tell us a little bit about how you see the problem of security in Chile, which is relatively new to us for the last 4 or 5 years, the crisis of security in which we are no doubt in, probably starting with the social upheaval that we had in 2019, but obviously coming from before also.
Thank you very much for the question. I would say, first of all, that from a Chile security perspective, I have to say that we see from Chile that Latin America is one of the most violent regions on earth. This is it's a fact, as well as one of the weakest on its state-making processes. Why it is important? Because sometimes we focus on the analysis only in criminal organization and narco-traffic, but we don't focus the analysis on the state. And the state in Latin America is very weak. I mean, the level of the institution. Also, Latin America is a region highly fragmented in a poor state-making process, and this is also affecting the general result. Why? Because the criminal organizations are acting in some way to affect the disorganized state. It is the organized crime versus the disorganized state. I mean, if we want to improve the condition in general in the region, we have to also focus on the level of institution at each state. And we are suffering now, I would say, regarding perception, The expert and general public in general consider that 9.5 out of 10 Chileans that criminal organization and narco traffic are our main problem. But it's not the only one. If we focus in Latin America, and I have to say that in Latin America, many countries are suffering now illegal mining, especially of gold. It's lucrative, often more profitable than drugs trafficking, and it's now a major driver of organized crime. What that means that the organized crime has very different kind of business. One of them is drugs, the other is illegal mining. The other is different portfolio of different threats. Those illicit activities we see that are contribute to affect environmental destruction, forced displacement, violence and human rights abuse, corruption of state institutions. Regarding narcotic and cocaine in particular, I would like to highlight the following. The new most important superhighway to export cocaine in Latin America to Europe, it is in the upper Amazon now. They took the drugs from Colombia, Peru, to the Urique city, and they translate to the Manaus and then to the Belén, and from Belén it is being exported to Europe. Why this is important? Because Europe is the continent that now it is where most people is consuming cocaine more than the United States. Regarding classical drugs, this is the main future, the main thing. And I would say also that regarding synthetic drugs like the fentanyl, I would like to say also that it is trafficked by the Mexican to the United States. But if we consider the last 4 years, I would say that 300,000 people has died in the United States because of the fentanyl. And this could be a reality for the hemisphere and also for Chile in the short term. Also, I would like to add some figures. In 2024, it were produced 3,700 tons of cocaine. This is 34% more than in 2022. This amount is increasing as I would say more than 200% compared with 2015. What that means that we are in the more important development of producing cocaine in the region, at least during the last 20 decades. In Latin American, organized crime has become the main, I would say, factor to the institutional or threat to our stability. If we focus on where the cocaine is being exported, it is mainly to, as I said before, to Europe, France, UK, and Italy in that order. And from where? I would say, well, the main destiny is Belgium, Spain, and Netherlands in that order. Why Belgium, Spain, and Netherlands? Because of the port. Belgium, Amberes, Spain, Barcelona, and Netherlands, Rotterdam. Well, this is the situation in general regarding drugs, but I would say also that Latin America is not a Pacific region, because we do have among the 50 more violent cities in the world, we have 40 cities out of 50. Brazil, it has 13, Mexico 11, Ecuador 5. Well, this is the situation. The Inter-American Development Bank estimate that the direct cost of crime and violence in Latin America is 3.4% of the GDP, equal to nearly 80% of the region's entire public education budget. That is the situation in general in the hemisphere. What about Chile? Well, rising gun violence has significantly reshaped Chile's political climate, especially ahead of the November 2025 presidential election. Every candidate is very worried about the security in our country. Crimes like kidnapping and extortion and surgeon, largely driven by foreign criminal groups, most notably the Venezuelan Tren del Agua. But I have to say that the current situation in Chile is one in which we are suffering not only the action of regional criminal organizations from Venezuela, from Peru, from Ecuador, and even from Brazil, Primer Comando Capital or Comando Vermelho. Those are present in our country now. This is reality. Chile homicide rate has risen from 2.32, homicides per 100,000 inhabitants in 2015 to more than 6.4 in 2024, which is to the average of the region not so bad, but for us is regarding the perception of security has been fundamental, and now it is I would say the most serious threat that we are facing. What is the economic impact of crime is substantial. The Center for Economic and Social Politics of the Catholic University report estimates that crime costs the country $8.2 billion annually, or about 2.6% of the GDP, disrupting business and daily life. And also, if we check the amount of assassination of homicides that happen along Chile, I would say that we observe that in general, they are focused more on the north of the country, but also in the center, in Santiago. But the evidence also presents that even in Coyhaique, which is one of the southern cities, it is affected by the criminal organization and assassination. The other important thing for security challenge in Chile is illegal immigration. I mean, migration is not bad in itself, but also I would say that the surge in immigration, particularly from Venezuela, the immigration that is not controlled, have strained social services and fueled public debate over identity, resources, and crime. And the foreign criminal organizations such as the Tren del Agua have been involved locally in trafficking and even high-profile assassination, as it was the murder of dissident Ronald Ojeda that was detained in the U.S. in December 2024. That represents, I would say, some of the risk and threat that we have to focus more on. What about the illegal immigration? Well, we have a population of 20 million of inhabitants in Chile, according to the last, to the 2024 study, and there is I would say, almost 2 million of people who is immigrant. 38% from Venezuela, 33.6% from Peru, and 10.9% from Colombia. That are the main people that we have as immigrant in Chile, which, by the way, we need a lot of the immigrant regarding the last sense, because we are increasing population, but not at the level in order to maintain our population. The problem is with illegal immigration. We have almost 400,000 of people as illegal immigrants now, and we don't know who they are. We don't have biometric registration of who are those people. By and large, Chile is facing a serious transnational threat without I would say, stronger national security institution. We don't have it. I would say that the main challenge now how to adapt the state Chilean institution in order to face that kind of threat or risk, and also to use opportunities. But we don't have it. We don't have a robust intelligence system in the country. I mean, we have an institution that are very strong, but they were designed not to face the kind of threat, transnational threat that we're facing now. If we're facing transnational threat, we need to do business in a different way. We have to enhance our level of institution. We have to also, to transnational threats, to focus more in multilateral answer. That means to coordinate with the different countries because we are facing the same problems. I would say, I'm going to finish here, saying that this is our most serious challenge, and we we are in a window of opportunity that is closing regarding how to face security. We are now at time to develop a serious strategy in order to face the most security threat. We are at time now, but this window is closing.
Thank you, John. I like that it's time now, because one can get very pessimistic about this. People get very anxious, and I absolutely agree with you. It's time now. Rachel, the episode a few days ago, a week or two ago, of these Russian drones coming into Poland, I see as kind of symbolic in a way. How prepared is NATO? It's the first question for that. But if Russian drones can just seep into Poland like that, what is Putin really up to? He's just banned RUSI in Russia, I believe. But I mean, it seems to be. I mean, what is there any limit? What are the possible checks and balances in Russia when it comes to taking a really drastic step? Can anyone stop him at all? The other thing is that you've written a book fairly recently on sort of lack of political will in Europe, and I don't know whether this in any way is related, because it has a lot to do, obviously, with NATO. Either in this round or when you have a moment afterwards, I mean, is China so much of a threat? Isn't it a little bit careless of the United States to gang up India, China, and Russia together? I mean, what would Kissinger say about that? And do you think there's any going back to the rule of law, to sort of rules of world governance and sort of orderly world? Or are we really now set for the next 50 years or so in a world of sort of multipolar centers of imperial greed?
Three very small questions. Okay, I'll answer almost the easiest one first, which is about Russia. So this is always, when I was at NATO, this was always the question: what's the intent? And initially, I think people believed it was quite narrow, that it was around Russia just reclaiming control of what they would call their sphere of influence. So we saw that with the invasion of Georgia in 2008, the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and some of the presence that they retain in our in Transnistria, Nagorno-Karabakh, all of these places, that it was just, okay, well, they're feeling insecure and they want to make sure that around their periphery they've got some measure of security. And so Ukraine is about reclaiming some of what they see as their rightful sphere of influence. But I think, watching Russia's behavior and how it's behaving not just towards Ukraine, but generally in the region as a whole, and how it's cooperating, as you said, with other countries that we would consider, adversaries of NATO. It probably is a bit more than that. And I think the prize for Russia would really be to undermine NATO. And they don't need to do that by attacking in a conventional way any of NATO's members. They can do that by trying to undermine the integrity and the credibility of the Article 5 guarantee, which says an attack on one is an attack on all. So when we see activities like the drones going over into the border in Poland, it's absolutely not an accident. We've had previous cases where missiles have gone across the border from Ukraine to Poland or into Romania. Those are accidents, but when it's, 19 drones or however many it was, that's not an accident. That's a deliberate provocation and a probing, one, of NATO's defenses and detection capabilities, and two, of political will. And I would argue that if NATO countries collectively, with the support of like-minded partners around the world, don't push back and call this out for what it is, Russia will just continue to push the boundary. And next time, there may be casualties involved. And Russia operates deliberately below the threshold of armed conflict because they know that that would trigger NATO's Article 5 in a very automatic way. So if they can do this probing in a way that doesn't cause mass casualties and creates ambiguity about the intent or the source or anything around that, it slowly chips away at the credibility of Article 5. NATO's run a number of exercises to try to get better at thinking through responses, but in the first instance, exposure, calling it out for what it is the first step, and then thinking about some responses. And this is not to say that you need to, suddenly lob conventional missiles into Russia. You could do this through a quiet cyber attack. You could do this through phone calls, letting them know of the consequences of their behavior. You could do this through sanctions and other forms of economic warfare. So there are a number of ways you can respond, but I think the important thing is not to just conclude that because nobody died in this instance, that we've averted a crisis and can walk away, because the next time it will be something more probing and more serious. Your second question was about China, and I'm glad you mentioned this cooperation between sort of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This is also, I think, a symptom of the U.S. stepping away from this leadership role in the world, because countries like China are moving in to fill that vacuum. At its quietest, China's stepping in to kind of replace the U.S.'s soft power. So you can almost hear the narrative in the corners of the United Nations going up to small and middle-sized countries who don't have a seat at the table and saying, those Westerners, the U.S., they always lecture you and set conditions, and I'm going to offer you a different alternative. You don't need to worry about all this talk about human rights and conditionality. If you come with me, we can do a deal without the values in the way. So they are definitely willing to step in, tell a very kind, benign narrative, and try to get more small and medium-sized powers to kind of join their group. And China is very patient. They're making strategic investments, I'm sure as all of you see, in areas like green energy and tech, critical minerals. I think you mentioned mining and whatnot, and they'll be very critical infrastructure. They'll be very patient in terms of the acquisition and the foothold in these areas. But then, 10, 20 years down the road, you'll realize, the entire communication structures of European railways or the entire port network is controlled by China. And that then bleeds over into the security and defense space and limits your choices. And so I think China's a really interesting actor to watch. I'm not sure I'd put them in the same kind of revisionist threat category as Russia, but they are certainly patiently trying to displace the U.S. And other countries as the keepers and the enforcers and the setters of the rules that have kind of governed our behavior for the last 5 decades. Is there any going back? Yes, I think there is going back, but it's not going to be a going back to what there was. It's going to be a rebuild. Because frankly, what we were trying to maintain was not working. I just talked about the unwieldiness of the membership structures in NATO and the EU. It is a bit preposterous in a UN context that countries, in Latin America don't have a seat at the Security Council. I don't know who the obvious candidate is, but if we want people to return to believing in those organizations as the ones who can help solve their problems or take up the mantle of their issues, we've got to reform those. So there is a going back, but it won't look the same. And I really appreciated the point on the role of the private sector, because a lot of these transnational challenges, whether it's tech or whatnot, government won't have the answers, they won't have the knowledge. So it's going to have to be much more of a public-private partnership.
María Luisa, how do you see Latin American countries positioning themselves between this benign-looking China and probably a little bit forgetful United States, who's not really focusing on Latin America very much? You mentioned Mexico, and it has this long border with the United States, which obviously has a big effect on Mexican policy, certain limits to what Mexico can do. But at the same time, I believe that Sheinbaum is helping Cuba a lot. I mean, it is a very radical government in a way. I mean, they've managed to change the constitution. The judiciary is becoming more and more politicized. Checks and balances are disappearing more and more. I don't know, there's a couple of questions. And maybe, I mean, you're Peruvian. Maybe you can tell us something about Peru. Because I'm always, I mean, in Peru, in Chile, we rather admire Peru because the businesses have done terribly well there. You have taken over a lot of our agricultural products because you have better climate, and there seems to be a good business environment, and yet there seem to be really messy politics, and both Congress and the executive seem a little bit chaotic.
Right. So, in terms of China and the response, I think that a way to address is this north and south response that I was talking about, right? The countries that depend strongly on the U.S. And that is certainly Mexico, that is Central American countries. We have seen recent responses, for instance, on the Mexican front on tariffs for countries that they do not have a free trade agreement with. So there's an effort from the Mexican government before the review of the USMCA, and I would expect that to continue, again, given the importance of the U.S. When we try to assess how is going to be the positioning of South American countries, then it becomes more complicated. I think that there is a division also within South American countries, some countries that are sort of like in between. When we see the share of the trade, of the exports, particularly to China, there's also a difference within Latin America, right? The level of exports of Chile compared with Colombia, for instance. Colombia has always been sort of like in the middle between the north and the south. So it is difficult to assess, but what I would expect is for countries like Peru and Chile to continue trying to maintain this sort of like neutrality, to maintain good ties with both countries, to not antagonize with any of them. But then again, this is a question of what are the demands from the other side and what type of response you can do depends very much on what is the demand, if there happens to be a demand. And then in terms of Peru, I mean, Peru is among the countries that is going to have an upcoming election, so I would expect for some electoral uncertainty, which traditionally happens and it's quite salient before the election to add to other challenges and for instance to any type of US related risk, which now seems to be a bit smaller than it was feared at the beginning. I guess that one of the issues that Peru is facing that is quite unique, but at the same time is very much shared with our countries, is the level of fragmentation and discontent, right? So if you ask people how much they support their institutions, how much they value democracy, how much they trust the government, Congress, political parties, this trust is very, very, very low. At the same time, we have there is an enormous amount of parties that are already registered to compete in the upcoming election, which adds a great degree of uncertainty. There are close to 40 parties, and that would be twice as much as the number of parties that competed in 2021. It is true that there has been a lot of political volatility, and that has not been, I would say, fully reflected in some cases in the economic and business environment, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't been reflected. And there are some years that have been particularly tough if there happens to be protests and potential change in government, and I don't know, some time of something related to climate. So I wouldn't agree with a sort of like with a point of view that the politics do not matter for the economies. Just that in some cases it hasn't, the level of political volatility hasn't been fully reflected on the economic environment.
Thank you. John, I was really interested in when you said what you talked about the weakness of the state, and Nicolas Grau, the finance minister, this morning was asking a question which I thought very interesting. He was saying, what sort of state does Chile really need? I mean, it's there's a lot of talk about the size of the state, and some people want a small state, and some a big state, but maybe the real question is the one posed by the minister. That is, what kind of state do we need? That was one question. The other question is, what kind of cooperation do you think that there could or should be between countries in Latin America and over the world in general in respect of organized crime? Because I was a bit shocked to hear that Europe is now the biggest consumer of cocaine. What kind of interaction is there between European authorities and authorities in Chile or Latin American countries? I mean, this question for you also, Luisa. Because I find that sort of rather scandalous. And obviously we have cartels all over Latin America now. There are obviously cartels in Europe which are also cooperating and receiving and distributing all these illegal drugs. Of course, there are some people, President Petro of Colombia, for instance, who thinks that the solution to this is the legalization of all drugs. I don't know what you think about that, because that's, I mean, my personal view, for what it's worth, is that if you legalize one drug, another one will come up, and I mean, there's no end to, there could be no end to the process of trying to legalize things. You might just as well legalize everything in that case, because now it seems that one of the biggest businesses of the cartels is, as you said, illegal gold mining, for instance, or siphoning off a bit of exported petrol or whatever. I mean.
Yeah, well, I would say that first of all, in order to face the current threat, we need a state more robust, more adequate to the risk that we are facing. We have to change, I would say, some security institution. We have to stimulate the whole of government approach inside the state in order to have the entire instrument of power available to deal with the risk and threats. I would say that we need a small but more efficient state, not necessarily a big state. But we need to think strategically now what the kind of state we have to build in Chile in order to succeed, or at least trying to neutralize the main risk and threats. This is a discussion that we are not having in a daily basis. What the state that we're going to need it. The thing that I know is that we need to modify the way in which we do business. And this is only a responsibility for the state? No, it is basically a responsibility, of course, from the government, private actor, entrepreneurs, the academy, I would say the entire Chilean society. We have to be very focused on what the kind of state that we want to build in order to get more security, more development. Because at the end of the day, security and development are two faces of the same coin. I mean, they are highly intertwined. You can be a developed country if you don't have a very good security. You can be a secure country if you don't have development. I would say that that's the kind of state that we need to build. And also to assume in the near term, what about the security institution that we don't have it? In the UK, do you have the national security system with a robust intelligence system? In Spain also. In Europe, more than 80% of the states that belong to NATO have security institution, national security one. In Latin America, it's no more than 20. Why? Again, because it seems to me that we need to have that discussion, to have that conversation in order to develop that kind of policies. And regarding to what we could do in order to face the main threat, I would say that at the end of the day, we are going to be affected, if you want it or not, by the criminal organizations that are doing their business. The question 20 years ago, was not if the criminal organization will arrive in Chile. It was when. But what kind of effort we developed in order to prevent that? I would say we didn't develop some kind of strategy in order to fight the threat. But, and additionally, we are in the middle of a global competition and confrontation, and we're going to face also some geopolitical challenge, like at the Antarctic continent, the geopolitical position of Chile, the southern tip of the continent, maritime and strategic geography. We have to think about it, because we are going to, if we want it or not, we're going to be that kind of problem in the near future. We have, on the other hand, a window of opportunity regarding natural resources, copper, lithium, rare earth, and green hydrogen. This is very good news for us, because we do have that kind of resources. Why in Antarctic? Chile faces long-term challenge in reinforcing its presence, sovereignty claims, and environmental stewardship in the face of growing geopolitical interests in the region by the US, China, and Russia. Why the Antarctic continent is relevant? It is a key place for global communication. The Antarctic ground stations are a key element of that strategy. That's why China has 6 stations in Antarctic. 1 in the territory that we claim, but 6. The power that controls the poles will have greater advantage to strengthen its position as a maritime power of global reach. That's why the Arctic and the Antarctic are so important. Chile as a country is a key point for communication with the Antarctic continent, with Punta Arenas being the most important port that ensures this condition. And this is also our important issues that we have to deal with if we want to improve our security. Also, Chile controls and exercises sovereignty over the main bioceanic passage between Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. The Strait of Magellan, the Beagle Channel, the passage through the Drake Sea. And those are going to be very important in that competition and confrontation between the United States and China. They are present. This is going to be more important in the near years to come. The main challenge for Chile, I would say, at present is maintaining neutrality and preventing South Pacific militarization while protecting sea lines and Antarctic interests. And to finish, I would say that The main threat that we are facing now is how to deal with the criminal organization. As you asked, that required a multilateral reaction. We had to engage the countries of South America in order to have a common policy, in order to tackle all at once the main threat that is destroying our nation. I mean, it's so clear that we have to that could be the main objective. It's not only for Chile, but for the entire region, highly necessary at the same time that we tackle the threat to enhance our own state-making process of each state, to have better institutions, better governability, because the criminal organization is using, when they are weak, they use that in order to improve their activities. Chile's main challenge is managing, I would say, asymmetrical interdependence, economic reliance on China, we have, and security reliance on the United States, and growing strategic importance in lithium, technology, infrastructure, and Antarctica. The risk is being forced into binary choices that undermine our long-term autonomy. The relevance, I would say, I would like to finish with that, of our economy, it should consider geopolitics and security factor always. And it seems to me that this has been a factor that in Chile we have not have talked about it with the importance that it needed.
Thank you, John. Well, unfortunately, gradually running out of time, not so gradually. The more interesting the conversation, the more time flies. So I'd like to ask each of you to make some concluding remarks, whether optimistic or pessimistic. I'm still interested in your book on Europe, Rachel. But anyway, just like 90 seconds each. Before we're...
Okay. Well, I mean, you know, since you mentioned the paper on political will, the first part of it was actually on military capabilities. So this was when I was at CSIS before my NATO job. We looked at what military capabilities Europe would need in order to be more independent from the United States and have more agency and capability. And that was a very easy exercise, but then we looked at the challenge of political will and some of the trade-offs that would be needed in order to sustain the level of investment that would be needed to realize those capabilities and that capacity and whatnot. And that was much more problematic. And you know, listening to my colleagues up here, I can imagine that that is also a challenge in Latin America. You know, where do you focus? Do you focus on some of these internal security challenges? Do you focus on state building? Do you focus on the economics of things? You know, where do you prioritize? What's the relative level of investment? So I think that I hear a lot of shared challenges among the regions. I guess my parting comment would be something that I read in recent days about the U.S. strategy. I think, you know, you opened by saying that U.S. policies are not affecting Latin America as much as maybe feared. But was not lost on me that the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in the Pentagon in recent days, who had been a real Indo-Pacific hawk and really focused on the U.S. Rebalancing its capabilities and its attention on the Indo-Pacific region, has now said, well, forget that. That's all too difficult. And we're going to now focus our national defense strategy on the homeland and on the Western Hemisphere. So for everybody here, I don't know if that's a positive or a negative, but then again, when you lay out some of those challenges around migration, drugs, economic resilience, if we are being a little bit optimistic, I think insofar as there's an overlap between U.S. interests and the interests of the region, there may be grounds for cooperation in a more positive direction.
Cool.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess that I was referring more of like the region as the main priority of, but and probably on the trade front, like Latin America in general ended up like faring like relatively better than other regions. But I agree. I guess that one of the like if I'm like sort of like trying to sum up what we have all said, in a way there is now, and I wonder if this panel was conducted some years ago, we will have been talking about the structural reforms that are needed in many of the countries in the region. And it's quite interesting that that discussion is sort of like already there, but not there anymore, because there's like a sense of a more urgent and a threat that is now and that needs to be solved now, as you mentioned, that the window was closing. So I guess that the common thread for the whole region has to do precisely with crime, and that has been reflected in day-to-day, in illegal mining, in drug trafficking, in the day-to-day of people, but it's also increasingly being reflected in politics and in the main concern of voters, which take me to the main challenge. And I guess that one of the key challenges has to do with better understanding the geopolitics apart from the politics, right? So I think that has also changed. So there is a growing trend in these countries to try to understand what is going on in the region and beyond the region. And we haven't talked much about the opportunities, but I guess that all of this forum is to talk about the opportunities, but certainly there are opportunities on natural resources, as you mentioned, and many other areas that are also shared among different countries in the region.
Okay, thank you. I would say that the decline of state came both from within and from without, considering the transnational threats. That means that we have to deal with both. I mean, now we have no other chance. We have to deal with both. And I would say that in order to tackle that, we should enhance the rule of law, secure and control the borders. This is going to be needed. The free market, very important. The stable finance, I would say, absolutely important. That means that we have to deal better with security and development, and put together in a strategy, in a national strategy, the security and development for the well-being of our citizens. And this is, I would say, something that we need in the very short term.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rachel, María Luisa, John, for a great discussion. Let's come again next year. Amen.